Anybody who reads your book will be struck by your tendency to fall back on physics analogies. You have an especially interesting metaphor in regard to electrical circuits, which I guess you teach, is it high school or middle school students, the basics of electric circuits?
Yeah, it's high school.
For those out there listening to our podcast, you might remember this from high school. There's an energy source, which is usually denoted by two parallel lines of unequal length. And then you have a resistor in the circuit, which is squiggly lines. And the battery drives the resistor. And at one point in the book, you analogize autogynephilia to essentially a short circuit. It's a circuit that has no resistor, and it kind of like just drives this infinite current, which you analogize to an autogynephilic male who then expresses his or her sexuality in a hypersexualized way that's almost like a satire of feminine appearance. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you are. What I was looking at was to look at how that heterosexual relationship works, modeling the male sex drive as the power source in the circuit, and then perhaps modeling the female response as the resistor. So men will have a relationship with a woman, and the man might want the female partner to do all sorts of things and wear all sorts of clothes, and the woman in the relationship will say, no, too cold, too uncomfortable, not doing that. Whereas what autogynephilia is a relationship with yourself. It's that image of yourself as a woman. So what happens here is there is no external load in the circuit. The only load in the circuit is the internal resistance in the cell. I'm using physics terminology again there, but it means that this short circuit can drive big currents with little to resist that current, and with somewhat spectacular results at times, as we've seen.
One example you give is meetings of similarly situated couples that you attend with your wife, who wrote a lovely epilogue to this book, where there'll be trans identified biological men, trans women, at a meeting, and they'll bring their wives, conventionally non-transgender women, and you note that sometimes the women are dressed in this very sensible way because it'll be cold outside and they'll be wearing like slacks and a sweater or something. But sometimes the autogynephilic constituency in the room will be dressed more as like stereotypical pinup women from like the Cold War period or something like that. Is that how it sometimes expresses itself?
Yeah, well, we've seen this. So, as my wife would point out in those situations, you can pick out the trans women from the women quite easily because the women are dressed sensibly and the trans women are not.
So are you familiar with the author Shannon Thrace?
Yeah, I've not read all the stuff, but I'm familiar with who she is.
She wrote a wonderful book called 18 Months, a memoir of a marriage lost to gender identity. And in some ways, it's kind of a companion volume to your book because she describes her, as he once was, her husband, who in the middle of the relationship discovered or announced that he was a trans woman. But by her account, which is the only account I have to go on, he lacked any kind of self-awareness. So he reinvented his past. He forced all of the changes in the relationship on her. And she wrote this very touching book. It's called 18 Months, a memoir of a marriage lost to gender identity. To read the two books side by side is quite fascinating because, again, by her description, her husband just, everything was about him. He never got out of his narcissistic bubble. And in your case, you seem to have a remarkable level of self-awareness. Is this a quality you had before you began to think deeply about gender and how it relates to yourself?
I guess no. And when I transitioned, I was as oblivious to other people as Shannon's husband. I was self-absorbed. I was self-focused at the time. Really, the only person I was thinking about was me. And I was also picking up advice, tips, and really following the lead of other trans people and not Stephanie. And I think Stephanie mentions in the epilogue that the low point was the April after I transitioned, which is about 4 months in, when she basically said that all you are thinking about is yourself. And if you want to keep the family life, you need to start thinking about us. And it was thinking about them, but it was also involving in decisions, and it was also going back to Stephanie as my first advisor, my best friend, the person I would talk to before anybody else. That was something which had just slipped and had just disappeared without me thinking about it. So that was at the time. I was in exactly the same place as other transitioners, other memoirs I've read. I'm thinking, yes, I was exactly the same.
The first couple of chapters of your book are conventional in that respect, because you're describing this sense of longing that you have, which is a product of gender dysphoria. You have one line here, I underlined it because I thought it was so evocative. I have likened my desire to become the other sex to holding down a beach ball underwater. And I think it's important for people to read things like this if they want to be part of the gender debate, because sometimes you do talk to conservatives who dismiss the entire idea of gender dysphoria. You describe it as a persistent and, I guess, debilitating psychological syndrome. It affected you every day, I'm guessing. It sounds like something that had an overpowering psychological effect on you. Is that right?
Yes, it did. It was something that never went away. It was there from when I was very little. It was something that I had to repress because it was something I just couldn't tell anybody else. I think you mentioned gender dysphoria. I'm not convinced that we should be using that term even. I think there's real conditions here. There are real psychological issues that people battle with and people struggle with. But the moment you apply a label gender dysphoria, and I mentioned this in the book, the moment you apply a label gender dysphoria, it's almost as if all these different conditions are the same, and I
Mm.
don't think they are. I don't think there's anything to connect, for example, middle-aged men who were desperate to become women with teenage girls who were desperate to escape from becoming women. I think those are two different conditions, totally different. But because we apply the same term, gender dysphoria, it's conflated the two, and I think that's unfortunate.
Your book steps readers through, I guess, what could be called a typology. I had some grounding in this typology because my former podcast partner was a woman named Deborah So, who was a Canadian sexologist. This is like 7 or 8 years ago, before any of this gender stuff was really mainstream. She was talking about within biologically male transgender people. By her description, there were two types. There were men who were gay and, for various reasons, essentially found it useful on a day-to-day level to simply present to the world as a woman, because it just made things easier in terms of their relationships. And there wasn't like a kind of complicated introspective aspect to it. It was just, this is a utilitarian thing. And then she described, again, by this, I think it's fair to say it's a controversial typology, but it sounds like one that you embrace, an autogynephilic, biologically male, trans-identified individual. Their identity is wrapped up to some extent in an attraction to the idea of themselves as a woman. And so part of this is, at least there's a sexual expression to it. If we zero in on this class of biologically male individuals who have autogynephilia, could you describe what that feeling is like? Because even within the book, your description changes. It's not just sexual, right? There's something deeper than that.
It's certainly not just sexual, because when we think of sexual, we think of that almost that intense, those intense feelings. But a lot of what we do is sexual in the way that we dress, the way that we interact with other people. Men tend to interact one way, and women tend to interact a different way. It's not hard and fast, and there's lots of traits which both sexes will follow. But there is certainly different patterns when you see how the sexes behave. And what happens with autogynephilia is that because you are effectively attracted to the idea of yourself as a woman, but this body is lamentably male, there's a circle there that just can't be squared. What I felt was going on was a desperate urge for me to feminize my body, to make it more feminine, so it would be more acceptable to me, and a body which I was more attracted to. Now, these things are just so shameful. You can't talk about this. Effectively, you are attracted to yourself. You fancy yourself, and which man wants to admit to that?
A lot of the people who are most supportive of sort of gender affirmation are also supportive of every conceivable sexual orientation except this one. This seems to be the one that you're not allowed to talk about.
Well, you're not. It's something which you keep very much to yourself. What you were saying about the other type of male transsexual, the homosexual type, by the time they actually transitioned, the job was already done. Everybody thought they were the opposite sex anyway, so it was just easier to go along with it. Whereas for me, it was a huge issue to actually admit to this and come out with this. And I guess you're in a position where there's a choice between fixating on the born in the wrong body narrative. So I had the misfortune to be born in the wrong body, and you can get sympathy from other people for that dreadful misfortune. But to say that you are actually sexually attracted to your own body, and because you're heterosexual, so you're sexually attracted to female traits, you want to change that body to make it acceptable to you, it's harder to sell that to the general public. So I guess that autogynephilic males who transition are desperate not to admit to this, to keep it quiet.
You talk about when you get dressed during the day. And if you're going to work, the last thing you're thinking of in a workplace is to be, sexually provocative. And yet at the same time, if you're dressing in a female way, you're still dressing in a way that is at least indirectly rooted in our sexual instincts about what looks male or what looks female. So the idea of sexuality doesn't necessarily mean you're just thinking about sex all the time, but it does create this spark that generates its own style of dress, its own mannerisms. Just to be clear to listeners, an autogynephile isn't somebody who's just like obsessed with sex any more than any other individual. However, the sexual dynamo they have within them does lead to all sorts of other forms of personal expression that, I guess, taken collectively express themselves as what we think of as transgender, yes?
Yeah, when I dress for work, I wear clothes which are typical of what everybody else wears, but I wear clothes which I feel comfortable in. I need to wear clothes which are suitable for teaching, but the clothes which I feel comfortable in, and also that I feel attractive in, and help me feel confident in who I am and relating to other people. Now, before I transitioned, I'd take care to wear a clean shirt and a tie which perhaps matched. I would do that. So what I'm doing now when I'm dressing in which would be more stereotypically female clothing is exactly the same. It's not different, but because I'm doing this in a different way, especially when people realize that I'm male, so I'm doing this in the way which is more typical of females, then it gets noticed. But I'm not doing anything which my colleagues aren't doing.
When we look at people who present themselves as activists for the transgender community, it's not a scientifically accurate sample because it's the people who are the most attention-seeking, people who are most militant in their outlook. And that's true of all activist communities. It's never going to be representative. However, that said, it's difficult to not notice the fact that some of the people who gain the most attention in this space seem to be middle-aged male narcissists. who have an almost pathological regard for their own sexual and attention-seeking needs, and are like, women, deal with this. I'm coming into your bathrooms. I'm like, it's almost, they almost seem to get off on, sometimes it seems, bullying women. But there's no link between autogynephilia and narcissism, is there? I mean, this is just self-selection among attention-seeking narcissists who happen to have autogynephilia. Is that the case?
I don't know what the link is between the two, whether narcissism and autogynephilia are comorbid more than you would expect. I don't know. But in some ways, we are describing a pattern of male behavior. Not all narcissists who behave like this are autogynephiles, but they're still engaged in narcissistic behavior where they'll put down women, speak over women, and put themselves first in every situation.
If you add in that bullying instinct with access to female spaces, that's where you get a recipe for further abuse.
It's an open door to men who want to impose themselves on women, is this. It's unclear how common autogynephilia is in the male population. Some suggestion has been 2 to 3%, similar to the prevalence of male homosexuality, but these are just guesses. But the prevalence of narcissistic behavior and self-serving and self-seeking behavior in men, it's not insignificant. And you can imagine how the overlap there gives license for men to really behave appallingly and to treat women appallingly, as we've seen.
You have this line here: I thought of myself as a woman, albeit with a trans history, and I assumed the right to use women's spaces and take up their places. In my mind, I had transitioned, and that was the end of the matter. This is on page 42 of your book. That describes to me an utterly conventional description of activist slogans. What was it that changed your mind about those slogans?
It was when legal self-ID was becoming a thing. So there was a debate in Parliament towards the end of 2016 about it, and this was going to be the liberation for transgender people. No medical tests, nobody to countersign it. If you decide you're a woman, then you're a woman. Until then, there'd been this gatekeeping involved. I worked out that this gatekeeping was important, not only to protect people from making mistakes, but also to give the impression that there was something real here. And people who'd been through this process had been through checks, they'd been through some gatekeeping. There was something real here. So when you came out the other side and said, I've transitioned, there was something to divide you from the weekend princesses. As I explained, I met for pizza with another transsexual person, and we looked at each other and said, they can't be serious about this. It's this impression of gatekeeping, which gives us the credibility to do what we do, and they're going to take this away from us. And what I wrote at the time, and this was before I started writing pieces in the press, I wrote it on my blog, and I said something along the lines of, if the state takes away the official gatekeeping, then groups of women will come up with unofficial and informal gatekeeping, which will be a lot less sympathetic to transsexuals than the legal gatekeeping which we've had hitherto. So I saw that as I saw it as an own goal. It was something I didn't want. I wrote to members of Parliament and said, this is not a good idea. And nobody replied to me, nobody responded. And it was a situation I was just feeling more and more frustrated with. So I started campaigning quite heavily against this self-identification, the importance of and calling out the folly of that and pointing out the importance of the gatekeeping. And then into 2017, there were women who were protecting their own rights and the importance of gatekeeping for them. And I found common purpose with those women. And it's when you find common purpose with them, I started listening to their arguments. And their arguments at the time we're being, our spaces are being overrun. We can't maintain our boundaries anymore. And up until that point, I'd seen myself as a woman essentially, and I was wanting to protect those boundaries to keep out the weekend princesses. But the more I talk to people and the more I talk to these women's groups, the more I realized you couldn't hold that situation where it was acceptable for me to do it, but not others. And I think the clincher of the argument, which was one of my female colleagues pointed out to me, that said, Debbie, we've got no problems with you. We know you. But if we let you in, then it's more difficult for us to shut the door on anybody else. If they can come along and say, you've let Debbie in, why not me? So it's at that point I thought, yes, there's a situation here. So I stopped using women's spaces at that point. I certainly wouldn't take up any women's places on boards or committees or in politics. I wouldn't do that.
It's such a telling story in so many ways, where I think you were on the subway or maybe a bus, and an older woman says to you, at first it's like a super rude and threatening thing. It's like something like, I don't know, I'm not going to do the accent, like, are you one of those blokes? And tell that story, because it ends in a very interesting way, and in a way that I think captures the good intentions of a lot of people on this issue.
I think it's important to assume good faith. So I was on the Underground in London, and a woman who is a good 20 centimeters shorter than me comes up to me. She's laden down with groceries, and she says, "Are you one of those blokes?" And what goes through your mind is, what do you do with this? So I said, "Why, yes, so I am." And she said, "You're very convincing." I said, "Well, clearly not convincing enough." And she said, "Good on you," and walked off. Now, what that said to me was that this was not transphobia. She wanted to know. She didn't have the language to explain what she did have the language. That was the language that she used to actually find out. She was interested in good faith. She wanted to find out more, perhaps just to confirm whether I was one of those blokes. And I smiled and I said, "Yes, I am." And then she complimented me on how well I was, performing the illusion, as some people would say. And again, in a semi-clumsy way, but by assuming good faith as what I did was, I was able to draw that out. Now, if she'd approached somebody else who was in the same position as me, that could have provoked a complaint to the police. The place was full of CCTV cameras. She would have been identified. She may have had a visit from police officers the next day.
I don't know if you've seen it, but a couple of years ago, there was this viral video of somebody who's clearly biologically male who was in just some kind of retail store, and there was like some teenage clerk who said, "Oh, hello, sir, how can I help you?"
Yeah, I know the video. Sorry, it's ma'am, wasn't it? And he got more and more upset. And yeah, I could have done, but there's no point in doing that. And if I do get, people do call me sir at times, especially on the telephone. And sometimes you just go with it because it's easier. I'm not gonna get upset about those things.
However, there's a chunk in your book where you talk about why it's so psychologically explosive for some trans-identified individuals to not only convince themselves that they're actually women, but to have the entire world complicit in that, and how even one stray piece of negative feedback can send them into a psychological spiral.
There's 3 levels of this. Your sense of being relies on the fact that you are a woman. You won't countenance the real reason for you doing this. What's going through your head is that you are really a woman. But as human beings, we are social, and we do interact with others. And so it's not enough for you to believe that you're a woman. You need everybody else to believe it as well. But for the illusion to work, it goes one step further for the illusion to have to hold. You've actually got to believe that everybody else believes it for you to actually maintain that illusion. And that's not the case. People don't, but we've got to believe that they do. And one person looking and saying, "Well, I don't believe this," just breaks the illusion. And I'm speaking from personal experience because I was there, when I transitioned. This was the reason I transitioned. I thought I was some kind of woman. And somebody else saying that I don't think you are really cut me through to the very core.
But now, the story you just told, where the woman says, "Are you one of those blokes?" You treated it at arm's length. Getting to that stage, was that the same process as coming to terms with the idea of autogynephilia, or is that separate?
No, it was. It followed my coming to terms with autogynephilia, because that then enabled me to understand myself in terms of, my sex drive and my sexuality. And bizarrely, it gave me more confidence in who I am.
This comes back to, you love physics and chess, that you like understanding how things work. And is it possible that once you understood how your mind worked, it felt less fragile?
Yeah, and how I see now is I'm a male person who prefers to be perceived by the rest of the world as a woman. That's who I am. And if other people say we don't believe you, well, it doesn't matter. I'm not in a position where I depend on other people's feelings. If I say my preference is to be perceived as a woman, so I work hard in order to be perceived in that way, and somebody else says we don't believe you, you say, well, believe what you like. It doesn't bother me. Whereas when I was trying to convince myself that I really was a woman, when others people didn't believe me, that cracked the illusion. So I would say now that my perception of who I am is based upon more concrete foundations. The subtitle of the book is My Journey Back to Reality.
Mm.
And so that who I am now is based on concrete reality rather than the affirmation of other people.
Despite all your heterodox opinions on the subject, I mean, your book is literally called Transsexual Apostate, My Journey Back to Reality. And we can have a whole other conversation about the politics of saying transsexual instead of transgender, which I realize is a, a whole linguistic subplot. Suffice it to say that transsexual is seen as maybe a signifier of heterodox views within the trans community. But by the middle of the book, you're basically talking about how you rejected the very idea of gender identity. And I have to say, even for an apostate such as yourself, I found that surprising because, going back to that beach ball that you were trying to push under the surface of the water of your personality, wasn't that beach ball gender identity? Like, if that beach ball had a name, wouldn't it be gender identity?
Well, at the time, I would have perhaps called it gender identity. But looking back now, it wasn't. I think there is two sides to the sexual dynamic. There's how we're attracted to other people and how we signal our attractiveness to other people. So it's almost two sides of this heterosexual dance that we do. So there's both the orientation, it's how we're attracted to other people. Then it's what we actually do in order to attract those other people. And we do this all the time. Heterosexual people do it. What I would say is that homosexuality is a variation on the first, who were attracted to, and transsexualism is a variation on the second, how we do the attracting. We attract in a way which is more typical of the opposite sex. So that's how I see it. But you can explain the whole thing without gender identity.
It's not its own independent variable. It's created from other independent variables.
Yeah, it's actually rooted in our sexuality. But what we've tried to do with gender identity and gender dysphoria is divorce this from our sexuality. It's not surprising to me now that this has preceded the big push on children. Because what we've done is, if we say this is all bound into our sexuality, what we can say is then we put that hard line in and say this is something that adults can do, but we'll put a line in to say children can't. Wait until you've grown up. It's what we say to children for a lot of things. But because we've divorced gender identity, as we call it, and gender dysphoria from sexuality, then it becomes something that children can do and children are encouraged to do. So this is what troubles me with gender identity. It packages up what we used to call transsexualism, something for adults, and makes it acceptable for children. And the impact on children, I think, has been the biggest issue of all here. We talked about women's rights before. I'm not a woman, but I can appreciate how women's rights have been compromised in this. But what worries me more than all is the impact on kids. Women are reclaiming those rights and are doing. But when a child's body and their development has been permanently altered, they can't get that back.
In your case, you had several children before you transitioned. It'd be a very different story if surgeons transitioned you before you had an opportunity.
Yeah, and that's something which does trouble me. If I'd been growing up now, I would have been desperate for the hormones and the surgeries, like I was when I was 42, 43, and I realized it was possible. But my life wouldn't have been any better for it, as I explain. And what worries me is what's been happening to children is it's appalling. And you can and we should be separating what's acceptable for children, what's acceptable for adults. So, for example, I'd had 3 children, and then I decided, myself and my wife, we decided we didn't want any more children, so I had a vasectomy. So at age 34, with having had 3 kids, the health service signed me off for a vasectomy. The counselling was basically, why do you want a vasectomy? And I said, I've had 3 children, I don't want any more. And that was fine. But if I'd gone in as a 19-year-old and asked for a vasectomy because I didn't think I wanted children, they wouldn't have given me one. Go away, come back in 10 years' time. But when it comes to gender surgeries, which are far more profound, we haven't been making that distinction at all. And I think we should be viewing this in the context of other medical treatment, not as something which has been put to one side as something separate.
Throughout your book, there are scattered references to other people who maybe have come to terms with autogynephilia. However, is there any kind of community for people like you, which is to say, I mean, you're a subset of a subset of a subset. You're trans, you're biologically male, you're of the type, if we're using your typology, which I feel comfortable using, of sort of a middle-aged male who maybe has a self-attraction. But then within that small community, there's like a much tinier community of people who have come to terms with it and who don't speak in the exalted language of gender identity and affirmation and so forth. Is there any kind of like community for, I mean, do you have your own letter on the alphabet at LGBT Day, or like, is there an autogynephile section of the Pride Parade? I'm guessing there isn't.
There isn't. It's the one section of society which is not welcome at Pride, I think. But I've had enough of these communities.
This book might help. I mean, maybe you're going to become like the I Am Jazz of autogynephiles.
I have had, it's interesting the private messages I've had as a result of this, that you can contact me through my blog, and my blog's easily found. So I have been getting a stream of messages from the most common demographic are men who have twigged the fact that they're probably autogynephile, but are trying to avoid transitioning in as a result of that, because they've seen that it's the impact it has on family life can be devastating.
Well, you talk about how knowledge of the availability of these medical procedures becomes this artifact that has this real effect on your psychology.
It does, doesn't it? Imagine another scenario was there was some medical treatment that could extend your lifespan to 1,000 years. And it was available, and people were starting to get it. Somebody said, there's this treatment available, but you can't get it. You might, yeah. And it's that sort of long. If it's not available, you think, well, we can't, yeah, that's life. But the moment you see that treatment is available and you see that it's there, and these are the hoops you've got to jump through to get it, then you're desperate to get through those hoops. And that's how I felt with transition.
Not everybody listening to this podcast has thought about their gender identity to such extent that that's a thing, or has experienced gender dysphoria, again, to such extent that's a thing. But I think everybody listening to this podcast can probably remember a time when they were in an important relationship where they were acting in a way that was self-absorbed, and they later realized, oh my God, what I was doing and saying had this effect on somebody. And it felt super urgent to me at the time. But now, with the passage of time, I realized I was making either unreasonable demands on my loved ones or demands that at the very least should have been negotiated and shouldn't have been treated as absolute proclamations. Often in these situations, what's the answer? You go to a therapist. But it's the only, maybe there are other examples. It's the only example I know where the therapeutic community essentially encourages the narcissism of one party and discourages the kind of like give and take that's necessary in any relationship. You and your wife seem to have maybe stumbled, I'm sure it was a difficult process, found this process of give and take. But was there anybody who helped you do that?
No, we worked that out ourselves, I guess. I did have a therapist who was neutral at the beginning and tried talking me through the various scenarios, through the way forwards, through the different ways forwards. And I mentioned this in the book. About 2 or 3 sessions in, I'd been talking about transition. I needed to transition. I wanted to transition. And she picked a chair up and put it in the doorway and said, through that doorway is transition. And I'm going to block it with that chair. And let's talk about the other alternatives of things you can do. You can basically bottle it up. You can keep it to yourself. You could go on weekends with like-minded people. All these different ways forward. But none of it was satisfying. I was becoming more and more desperate. And in the end, it felt like months later, but I think it was the second or third session after that. I got up out of my chair, picked the chair up out of the doorway and moved it. And she said, right, okay, then we'll talk about transition. And at that point, clearly I'd made my mind up.
Did your wife ever feel gaslit during this phenomenon?
You'd really need to speak to her. But one of the things she has written, and she's talked about this, is that while I was lost in a world of my own around transition, other people were talking to her. And she was getting different messages from different people. She was getting the affirmation that you were really so lucky to be married to somebody so special,
Right.
which she said was unhelpful.
Yeah.
But she was also,
to put it mildly.
but she was also getting comments from people to say, what's going on here is so bad and so wicked that I'm not good. I feel I can't relate to you at the moment because you're actually colluding with this by not divorcing Debbie.
Also not helpful.
So that was not helpful at all. But she did have a number of friends who were rational, reasonable, and balanced in this, who were there to support her, which she had at the time, which was important to her.
One thing that's interesting, and you don't play it in any kind of explicit way, but it comes through, she at least, and maybe you, are churchgoers. I'm wondering how that played into this.
Church was a community where we found people were saw us as more than this couple where one was transitioning. They knew us. We were members there. They'd known us a long time, and we had kids. The children were going there, so they knew us as a family. So there was more to us than this, and that was important. It was certainly a challenge. It was certainly a challenge for the church in how to actually manage this and cope with this, because. Especially, I wasn't self-aware then as I am now, and I look back in horror at the things I was doing and the things I was saying, and people acted gracefully, really, and sort of grimaced and thought Debbie will get over it in time, I'm sure, and I did. So I relied on that from other people.
If you could kind of snap your fingers and go back in time and not move that chair and avoid transitioning, would you have revisited that?
I've said in the book that if I knew in 2012 what I know now, I wouldn't have transitioned. I only transitioned because I thought I was some kind of woman. Now I know I'm not.
You'd still be wearing the shirt and tie to school, and
Yeah, possibly. I could wear a shirt and tie now, I guess.
but
But
you still have the beach ball.
yeah, but it's come up to the surface. It's bobbling around. It's bobbling around on the surface now. But I wear clothes which I'm comfortable with, and I like having my hair long. Yeah, I do like wearing skirts, and I have that freedom to do that. And I'm thinking, do I really want to put that back in the box and not do that? But I think what transitioning did for me, I'm not a woman, so I didn't find that. I didn't find my true self as a woman, but it enabled me to discover myself as who I am, an autogynephilic male whose sex drive is partially at least reflected back in myself. And that gives me a kind of satisfaction that I finally understood myself. This 3-year-old boy that I describe at the start of the book struggled with these issues that he had no idea what was going on. Now I've worked it out, and that's satisfying. If I hadn't transitioned, I probably would never have worked it out. So you reach the same stage in life, just not understanding yourself. So in some very selfish way, transitioning was worthwhile because it helped me understand myself in a way that I wouldn't have been able to understand myself in if I'd taken any other course of action. Which sounds self-seeking, and it is self-seeking, but it's where we are.
Debbie Hayton's new book is called Transsexual Apostate: My Journey Back to Reality. Thank you so much for being on the Quillette podcast.
Thank you, John.